Not say big girls don't cry, because not all of the Bigfoot sightings could be of male Bigfoots. Obviously, we've heard of sightings of female Bigfoot sightings where there are younger Bigfoot sightings along with them. You know, kind of a family pod, or at least so I've been told. Never actually seen the photographs, although I'm told they exist. Kathy Strain, however, isn't waiting for the photographs. She's a manager for the Stanislaus National Forest in Sonora, California. She has an MA in anthropology, and it is doing research on native cultures and their traditional Bigfoot beliefs. Her book, Giants, Cannibals, and Monsters, says George Knapp, may be the most beautiful Bigfoot book I've ever seen. We're going to talk about that. What is her anthropologist's eye on Bigfoots? And for that matter, too, when we take a look at the subject throughout the night, what has she learned from the 57 or so different Native American tribes that she's investigated for this book? What did they know about Sasquatch that we have yet to figure out? Coming up next on Coast to Coast, this is Ian Punnett. Kathy Strain comes highly recommended. George Knapp expresses his regrets for not being able to be here tonight with you, Kathy, but I get you, so ha-ha.
Well,
and I am fascinated by your work as both somebody who appreciates the way in which Native American cultures compel us to sort of romance the stone of reality a little bit and see it from different angles. What led you to start investigating the tales, or let's call them the news reports, of Sasquatch from a perspective, from another culture's perspective?
Well, when I was a little girl, I saw Legend of Boggy Creek on television, and I was really quite small and heavily influenced by the movie. And I asked my teacher, what do I need to do to study Bigfoot for a living? And they said anthropology. And I was like, oh, okay. So that was just a natural course for me to follow. And then later on, I was very, very fortunate. My hometown is Porterville, California. And on the Tule River Indian Reservation above Porterville are the Hairy Man pictographs. And those are the only known paintings of Bigfoot. And I was very fortunate to get a personal tour of it by some elders, and they told me the traditional stories of, how Hairy Man had helped create man, and if it hadn't been for him, we'd be walking on all fours, because that's what Coyote wanted, and in gratitude, they painted themselves on this cave. And when it dawned on me that these stories were out there and they weren't written down, they weren't anywhere to be found, I felt a true, need to at least capture them, if nothing more than to have them live on for eternity. If nobody else thought anything else about it, it didn't make a difference. They're written down. They're in one place. They're company among friends. So that was my goal.
I love that. And so tell me, I would think, knowing a little bit about anthropology, knowing that at least the root word anthropos, right, from the Greek for people.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so as an anthropologist by training, how can you do anthropology of something other than something that's not anthropos, or do you put the Sasquatch in the same category that we would put people? Because some people like to think of him as a highly elevated animal. Other people think hominid. Other people think cousin. Where are you with that?
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, I don't think that he's Homo sapien as we are, but whether he's an hominid, something to that effect, I'm never going to be able to answer that question until we have DNA. I know that Indian people believe that he's a brother, and that's how they view him. And as an anthropologist, what I study is the culture that holds this animal in high regard in many different forms. And so seeing Bigfoot through their eyes is where the anthropology comes from, where you're not judgmental, you're not trying to make their stories fit my view of the world. I want to see it through their eyes and how they've had a relationship with this animal or this brother for 10,000 years, if not longer. And what can those stories tell us about that relationship, and what it is and what he is and what can he do.
Well, I think that brings me to a core question I had when I was reading about your book, Giants, Cannibals, and Monsters, is that there are some native traditions that think of Sasquatch as a cannibal. And I thought that was interesting because that would have to, by definition, would put Bigfoot in the same category as us, because otherwise it wouldn't be a cannibal. It would just be another predator. It would be some species, as a predator. But in order for it to be a cannibal, it would require us to be in the same club. So, which group was that, by the way, that thought of Sasquatch as a cannibal?
Almost all of them.
Really?
Oh, yeah. He is traditionally the most common story that is across the United States and Alaska and Canada is a Bigfoot with a basket on his back. And he goes around and sometimes he has pine pitch or other sticky elements on his hands, and he picks up children or adults and he puts them in their basket and he takes them home and he eats them. And most of the time it's a female Bigfoot actually that does that.
How about that? Yeah,
sometimes though they take them home for marriage and other, events. But a whole lot of cannibalism, and it's pretty much widespread throughout North America, and that determines a lot of how those tribes feel about Bigfoot today. The tribes that always viewed him as a cannibal respect him from afar, and they don't really want to have any interaction with him, but other tribes that saw him more as a creator, as a friendly overseer, still have a close relationship today with him.
Or her. And why is it then that some Native American cultures are so specific about it being a her that's doing the cannibalizing? Well,
I think that when you read the stories, they're very individual in the sense of, that it's the person who encountered the Bigfoot telling the story from his point of view or her point of view. And so those are the stories that are left. I mean, there may have been many other stories that were told that just we don't have any link to them any further. These are just the ones that made it through, being culturalized through, contact. And so I get the impression that women, the female Bigfoots, were always eating humans because it helped them put on body weight and made it through the winter. That was always sort of my impression. And in particular, young human children were fatty and very good to eat and tender when they were roasted. And so typically it's a female Bigfoot that's doing the gathering. Occasionally male, but most of the time it's female.
Very interesting. So again, we're talking about Kathy Strain's book, Giants, Cannibals, and Monsters. Monsters, I think of as being soulless creatures. Typically, that's how monster is defined. Some sort of creation that lacks a divine spark. So whether it's of a human creation or of the creation of an evil force or whatever, that's kind of where the monster category starts. Are you using that in the same way?
I'm using it in two forms. One of being those stories that Native people had that were intended to invoke into the kids, stay away from him because, they didn't necessarily want to tell him he was a cannibal, but he's a monster. So let me instill this fear into you so that you just stay away from him when you see him out in the woods. And the other view was that there are stories where the interaction between the Native people and the Bigfoot became so bad because of rampant cannibalism and so much theft that they felt they had no choice but to destroy that tribe of Bigfoots. And so they would, wipe them all out because they had enough of whatever the Bigfoot was doing. And so that's how I viewed monster, is that I have to destroy you in order to help my people survive.
Right. So monster maybe in the sense of being just monstrous as opposed to falling into that category completely. Well, that's so interesting. So of all the different Native American cultures that you studied for the book, the ones that were forthcoming about their Sasquatch traditions, how many of them spoke about a time when, at least in their tribal memory, they were at war with a competing pod or family group of nearby Sasquatch?
Oh, there's several. In particular, the Paiute in Lovelock Cave, that story of why it's black on the inside was because they got into a big battle with the Bigfoots, again, because they wouldn't stop eating their kids. And so they felt like they had no other choice but to kill them with fire in the cave. They trapped them in there, gave them all kinds of opportunities. Oh, if you'll change your ways, we'll let you live. And the Bigfoots refused, so they had to wipe them out. And around Lake Tahoe, the Washoe tribe has a similar story where they had no choice but to wipe out the entire family of Bigfoots because of their behavior.
Interesting. So the behavior becomes the issue, not just their foreignness. Are there any stories of cooperation amongst the Native American tribes and a Bigfoot group?
Oh, yeah. Washington, the Yakima, there's several tribes up there where they actually had active trading with Bigfoots, where they would, in those cases, they would leave things out at nighttime, go to bed, and in the morning the Bigfoot would take what he wanted and leave something in its place. But in Oklahoma, Arkansas area, there was actually face-to-face trading with Bigfoot for, usually Bigfoots wanted, woven artifacts like baskets or blankets or something to that effect. And in exchange, the Indians would get like fish or sometimes obsidian, those types of things in exchange. So,
well, that's interesting. What would be, and I'm certainly not doubting it, but then we could assume then that if a Bigfoot, if they were collecting baskets or blankets or something like that, then that does speak to a greater sophistication for the culture of the Bigfoot than I had thought previously had been reported. You know what I mean?
Well,
I mean, if they got baskets, then they're storing food or moving food using basket. I'm assuming they're not using them for hats or stuff like that.
Well, just recently I had this discussion with some California Indian basket weavers about that, and their impression was that they were curious about the items. They didn't know how to use them. They just could see that Indian people were using them, and they wanted to have those things just like they had. And so they would. The stories they had heard is that they would take blankets and they'd end up shredding them because they didn't understand the concept of putting them around them. And I had asked them the question, if Bigfoot's had baskets in the past to put, children in for cannibalism, how come they don't have it anymore? And their reply is always because we don't trade with them anymore and they're too stupid to make their own baskets. So we don't give them to them anymore, so they can't pick up any more kids.
Huh. Well, that's very interesting. And so, in a way, it speaks to, would it be wrong to say a stunted intellectual development, that they never made the jump into basic basket weaving like so many cultures do as sort of an entry-level community building kind of activity?
Well, we know culturally how humans develop through time, that they start out in one form and then given enough time, they're going to end up being city-states, large type, not villages anymore, but cities. And so that's all based on what your material skills are and what your needs are. And if you are doing just fine, you have a hair-covered body, you don't need to ever learn how to make fire, you're eating well, none of the food you need have to be cooked, you're not going to have a need to invent other things in order to survive on the landscape. And so I think that's really what that means is that they didn't have the need to do it. They were doing just fine. Humans are the ones that needed to change their environment and adapt in order to survive. So they invented baskets.
Do we have evidence let me back up. Do we have testimony from any of the Native American groups? And as you say, you interviewed 57 or so different groups to get their tribal outlooks on Bigfoot groups, Bigfoot culture. Are there any stories of Bigfoot cities or towns?
Oh, no, nothing to that. The sizes, and I didn't actually interview all the tribal people.
Okay.
A lot of these stuff are pre-1950s stories, and so some of them are in ethnographic works that have never been published, or they're in recordings. And so I didn't talk to literally all of them, but I have talked to many of them. But no, the Bigfoot always lived in small pods, I guess. That is probably not the right word, but usually a male with several females and lots of children, but nothing as big as something like a village or a camp or something to that size.
Well, what is the anthropological term for a gathering of Bigfoot?
We don't have one yet because he's not recognized by science. He hasn't been classified, and those terms haven't been delegated to for a better understanding. Once he's discovered, he'll be.
Why are we waiting? I say you get on the cutting edge of that, get on the bleeding edge of that, and invent a term to describe a family of Bigfoot, of whatever the Sasquatch groups should be called.
Well, it probably would be family or band or tribe. Is probably we use human terms.
Okay, well, I would suggest that you do that and then trademark it, and it become for something, another thing for which you're known. And because I think that part of what. There's a lot of skeptics out there. There's a lot of people that say, look, these are just stories and they're boogeyman stories or they're ghost stories, essentially. They're campfire ghost stories. What's your best evidence that you have as a scientist, as somebody who spent a little time in the anthropology department? What's your best evidence of the existence of a Bigfoot or of several?
Well, I think for me it is because, like I said, these stories and these traditions predate when Bigfoot hit the media back in the 1950s, and they have songs, they have dances. Sarah Winnemucca, who is a very famous Paiute, had hair of a Bigfoot. She claimed, we don't know where the dress is, but woven into one of her ceremonial dresses. He was clearly a very important part to these tribal people. And when you look at it from an anthropology viewpoint, the only animal that is widespread that has a similar characteristic across North America is coyote. You don't have anybody else. You don't have Thunderbird, who's all over the place. You don't have these other characters. So Bigfoot and coyote are the only ones that are pretty much across the landscape. And the Bigfoot pretty much shares characteristics across that. That isn't possible in prehistoric times to share that information. They didn't have the internet. They couldn't Google Bigfoot and go, I think I'll adopt that characteristic or this kind of animal. It's just not possible. And even if tribes traded with each other, that's not enough to suggest that they could share, like telephone, this animal. And so for me, the fact that he's in baskets, he's in rock art, he's in stories and songs and dances and all these things that are culturally important to these tribes, that's the best evidence there is. There's no doubt in my mind that they were looking at a real creature and taking it and putting it into their culture in order to keep it alive throughout time so that their kids would tell their kids to tell their kids.
We're talking with Kathy Strain. The book is Giants, Cannibals, and Monsters. George Knapp says it's a great coffee table type book, gorgeous, well laid out, and that the Bigfoot legends are the focus in the book. A couple of different tribes look at it a different way. The Sioux talk of Bigfoot as the big man, but also describe him as a trickster. And I think trickster work is very interesting. And I think to learn about the trickster, to find out what the trickster means, that's something that I want to explore a little bit more. The Bigfoot as the trickster, because the trickster is always the smartest one around. And so just to double check, going onto a break here, Jason? Okay. So we'll pick up there on the Bigfoot as trickster with our guest, Kathy Strain on Coast to Coast. This is Ian Punnett. Big time indeed, Bigfoot stories and a big book from Kathy Strain, like it so much. And the stories we're hearing about giants, about cannibals and monsters and different tribal perceptions of Bigfoot, of Sasquatch throughout the United States. I want to explore a little bit more, though, the aspect that she mentioned from the Sioux, that Bigfoot was thought of as the trickster. And trickster stories are very interesting to me in folklore. I'm having actually kind of a hard time fitting Bigfoot into that category of what it means to be the trickster. We'll talk about that next. Plus, also some regional aspects of this. From what are they all of these different tribes have the same story in the same area? Or are there different reports that really do portray a different type of Bigfoot, perhaps another species of Bigfoot from a different area in the United States in these first Americans? Next on Coast to Coast, this is Ian Punnett. So back with Kathy Strain, the trickster is one of those characters that takes many different forms. I guess it's a character type that takes different forms. We see it in the Bible. We see it in classically in Western mythology, Eastern mythology. You have the cleverness of a character being their survival tool. That the trickster often is the one that appears to be disempowered at the beginning of the story, the one that's being pursued, but has by pulling a kind of a Felix the Cat-like reversal on that other character that is either the antagonist or the predator, they end up in the end being able to embarrass or humiliate the powers, to reverse the table order, so to speak, and frequently sort of run away laughing, or to run away with the gold, or to end up on top somehow. That's the kind of some of the traditional themes of a trickster character. How does Bigfoot fall into that folkloric category of the trickster?
Well, it's actually pretty uncommon. Typically, when you think of trickster in anthropology, you're thinking of coyote. He usually is the ultimate trickster. But there are stories where Bigfoot will purposefully taunt Native Americans or steal things. They're really well known to wait, all day long when an Indian woman is pounding acorn, and then when she's leaching it in the water, steal the entire batch that she spent all day on. And it's very common now when you're out with Native Americans, if something goes wrong, like one time I was out in the field with the local tribe, and it's typical to set your keys on your windshield, because if somebody's going to steal your car, there's the keys, and they just won't break the window. And when we had come back, the keys had been placed really high up in a tree, and they blamed Bigfoot for that. They said, "Oh, there he goes again, trying to drive us crazy and just torment us." And so, for the few stories that there are, I would almost use the word tormentor rather than trickster. Because,
I think that's better. I think that's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, trickster has some playfulness to it, and tormentor. Right. I don't know of anybody that I've ever heard say they've heard a Bigfoot laugh before, so it's more of a bratty little brother kind of behavior versus somebody who thinks he's being funny. That's
right.
My viewpoint, anyway.
I think that, and that's the kind of nuance I was talking about, because I was having a hard time seeing how Bigfoot would be compatible with the trickster. Coyote stories, for people that don't know, do you want to give us like 2 minutes from an anthropological standpoint on the role of coyote?
Well, he is just the most playful prankster. He never means any ill will for what he does, but, he lusts after certain things, and in order to get it, he's willing to do whatever it takes. And so if he sees a beautiful woman, he's willing to pretend that he's her husband in order to get to know her better, and then change back into his own self. And he doesn't see anything wrong with it. He's not doing any harm. He is just playful. And so there's never any time when coyote is going to hurt somebody. And you'll see that in stories where if an Indian woman or man say, that was wrong and you're going to cause great grief for doing that, he'll back off. And just the opposite would be true of Bigfoot, that you could say, don't eat me, don't take me, and there's really never any mercy given to that person. They're like, what? I'm hungry, I'm going to eat you anyway. So I think that's the big difference, is that there's a moral conscience to a coyote if asked, versus there doesn't seem to be a morality type, conscious address to a Bigfoot.
I was on Facebook earlier, and I was getting, for whatever reason, this guy was sending me a taunting email about me being from the Midwest, and so therefore I'm not as sophisticated as he is, and he's on one of the coasts, I guess, and so he was referring to me as Midwest trash. Well, I bring it up for a reason. What I thought was interesting about that is that you don't hear that kind of regionalism anymore, right? I mean, we're all fairly homogenized because of all of our access to the same media. We have the same experience from network television, network radio, that no matter where we are, we share so much now as a culture, and there's less of this sense of, oh, you're from that part of the country, you're a rube. I mean, it's just not as. So I was surprised by that, but then it made me think about in kind of the First Nation people. Are there ways in which they look at Bigfoot that reflects a kind of regionalism?
Probably not in how Bigfoot is described in that sense. What I see in particular is the tribes themselves, what they're willing to talk about is regional, for sure. Like when you talk about the southern tribes, like the Cherokee and the Choctaw and the Comanche, they're much more open about what Bigfoot was to them, and that he was, in their mind, at least in the past, not today, an acceptable marriage partner. And
really?
So, yeah, they will talk about that. You will never get anybody in California to even the suggestion will get you totally shut down.
Wait. That you got to unpack that a little bit. So, you mean by that it was a Native American marriage partner, or even times of any of the early white settlers?
Probably both.
I'll be darned.
Yeah, much more open sexually with those kinds of examples versus you don't talk about that here in California. So I have no clue if any of that was ever in their stories, because they've kind of been whitewashed in that sense. And then you see a lot more emphasis on in the, I would say, British Columbia, Pacific Northwest, where if a man and a female, it's always a female Bigfoot, had a relationship, it was always against his will. So
it was always against his will.
Always against his will. He didn't want it. He just went along with it because she, took him. And he always got away as quickly as he possibly could. First chance he had. And so, it kind of hints at the same things as the southern tribes do, but not as open. And so I see that versus more of, it's still a giant. He's still hair covered. Right. That doesn't change. It's just maybe what they're willing to talk about is different.
All right. I want to explore that a little bit because I'm curious. The fight or flight response that comes upon humans in general, but the male of the species in particular, rarely includes arousal. And I say that in the sense that if he was really terrified by the Bigfoot, if the Bigfoot was demanding sex, it's almost, for it to be against his will in that sense, becomes a harder thing to accept. It reminds me a little bit of some of the early biblical cultural stories of Lilith, of the of a kind of a demon that comes to, like the succubus that comes to men in their dreams, that kind of a thing. And that's what it makes me think of. I wonder whether those are just those type of psychosexual stories that are made up to explain things like nocturnal emissions or other things that they almost needed to create a story for what happened out in the woods.
And it's hard. I don't see those for a story in order to survive for hundreds of years. Those are typically not something that's going to survive. You have to talk about. I had a fight with my mom, and it was because she took my basket. Those things don't last for more than a week. It isn't going to be ingrained in the storytelling that happens around the fire at night by the elders to the kids. Those are the stories I'm talking about, the things that were so culturally important that they needed to be carried on for a very long period of time. And so I don't see that as being an explanation for this. What maybe the cultural sense of modesty or, what they view as sex outside of marriage, that kind of thing, I think is more what those might be. And, and typically, like one of the very coolest stories that I found actually involved Bluff Creek, where the famous, Patterson-Gimlin film was filmed. That there was a female Bigfoot that lived there, and the dad told the son, "Don't go down there. She'll take you as a husband." And he went down there anyway. And of course, he was with her for a period of time, and it was pretty lengthy. He got kind of sick of her. He had had enough, but didn't object originally. Tries to get away from her, and she's in love, and so she goes all the way to the coast by Eureka and decides that if she can't have him, nobody can, and she throws a rock intending to kill him, and instead she throws it too far and it ended out in the ocean, and that's Redding Rock, and that's still there, of course, and Indians still talk about that's how that rock came to be, and so that's more typical of Pacific Northwest type stories versus, Cherokee goes, "Oh, I fell in love with this Bigfoot. I married him. We're all good." That's
right.
the differences.
We're talking again with Kathy Strain. The book is Giants, Cannibals, and Monsters. You can link up to her through coasttocoastam.com. We talked about the cannibal part, monster part. Let me explore a little bit more on the giant part. How big was Bigfoot described in the Native American cultures?
Well, sometimes he's always, bigger than Indians, and sometimes they'll get into how wide he is. They seem to be very impressed with that. And depending on the story of what the action is, he can be monstrous size, like, 12, 15 feet tall and able to swallow whole humans, in one bound, fearful of that. They typically, though, it's always the same hair covered and that type of thing. But, nothing really that much bigger than 15 feet. And it's never used in the sense of where they list 15 feet. It's in comparison with a tree or something that has a known height that where you can kind of guesstimate that's what they're talking about.
When you mentioned the cannibals, I thought, what wasn't one of the cultures you looked at for the book? Didn't they describe them as being smallish cannibals?
Well, there can be. There's rarely a small, like a dwarf type Bigfoot that I haven't
kind
really
of
been
a pygmy Bigfoot.
Yeah, sort of.
A little foot.
There's
Bigfoot and Littlefoot?
A Littlefoot, but they're very rare. They don't happen very often, and that's actually one of the ones from the South. It's a Cherokee story where the Bigfoot is, I think he's like 3 feet tall, and of course, I'm only 5 feet myself, and so that doesn't seem now that small to me, but...
Everybody's a Bigfoot to you, is what you're saying.
Everybody's a Bigfoot to me. But in those stories, all the Indian women want him because he is just even though he's small, he's very, very powerful, and Indian women are throwing themselves at him and that kind of thing. But he only becomes a cannibal when he's eating his competitors, essentially. He's eating the men that would otherwise compete for these fair maidens. But it's a pretty rare story to have where it's a small-sized Bigfoot.
The art, the representations of Bigfoot that have come down to us over the centuries of Native American artists who have included them in one form or another in different expressions. What are some of the best known examples of that? Can we all go see them? I mean, are they all open to the public? Are they available?
Well, the hairy man pictographs are not, because they are on reservation land, and you have to stop into the reservation office and get permission in order to visit them, and rightfully so, because pictographs are very fragile, and people typically want to touch them and do all kinds of things, and so you have to have permission for that. But there are, when I give talks, I often play the songs that I've collected that are Bigfoot related. I've been trying to film a dance for the longest time that I haven't yet been given permission to do, but I know up in the Pacific Northwest they do have a Dawanka or a Tonaqua. She's a whistling woman, a wild woman of the woods, and they have a dance where they're in full costume, and it's clearly a Bigfoot, and that's who they think she is. And she does a dance, and the public is welcome to view that. But otherwise, I can't think of an example outside of modern artwork where Bigfoot is represented that's open to the public.
Because the wall carvings and the other things, those are, you have a couple of examples of rock carvings of early Western European visitors or Northern European visitors coming, and then there's an example carved into rock of them. And I would think that if the Bigfoot were coming with the kind of frequency that you described, that there would be more examples of that, whether that be, in trees or in caves or in paintings.
Mm-hmm. Well, part of that becomes an issue of us wanting to put on a picture, just like when you see the Mona Lisa, you have your ideal of what that's supposed to be. But in reality, you need the artist to tell you what they were representing. And so I've seen plenty of petroglyphs and pictographs that are very much Bigfoot to me, but I don't have the artist and I don't have the tribe telling me that's what that is. And so until you get them to say that, because it's true, then it just can't be. And so the Yokit tribe or the Tule River Indian Reservation have been very open about saying these are the hairy men pictographs. I don't have any doubt that there's not a lot more out there, but it can't be my interpretation. That's what I think it is. I need the tribal people to back me up.
Well, I guess that brings us to the guests coming up next hour. Harvey Pratt being a forensic artist who's done some drawings of Bigfoot. Have you seen the ones we've linked up on our webpage?
Oh, yes. I know them both.
Okay, you know them both well. Mm-hmm. And so based on what you know about the Bigfoot experience from the Native American perspective, how would you, if you had to describe for somebody who can't see a picture, how would you describe what the typical Bigfoot would be like? What are the distinguishing characteristics for you to carry us over into the next hour?
Well, I think a flat nose, very pursed lips. I think that's pretty, typical, a kind of a shallow chin. The artwork that Harvey has done is just amazing, and it does have more of a more human characteristic to it in the sense that it doesn't have as much hair. But I think that's not uncommon. I think Native people view Bigfoot as being a brother, and so for those artistic renderings to look like human doesn't surprise me in the least bit. I've never been fortunate enough to see one, so I don't have a clue what they're supposed to look like, but, that's as good as probably anything I'll ever see.
Right. And yet you spent a little time out looking for them?
Oh, yeah. My husband and I, Bob, we're out in the woods all the time looking for Bigfoot. He has a sighting. He saw one in 1975. I've seen plenty of footprints. I've seen plenty of other things, but I've never had a sighting. It's very frustrating.
I hope, Kathy Strain, that of the giants, cannibals, and monsters you might run into in the woods, they don't turn out to be the cannibals.
Well, I hope not either, but
yeah.
I'll give them indigestion if nothing else.
Well, the way you describe yourself, you'd be just an appetizer anyway.
Probably so.
Well, thank you so much, and so much enjoyed this conversation, too. And really, again, George Knapp sends his regrets and highly encourages people to take a look at Kathy Strain's book to get a much better idea of just how pervasive these stories are. I'm reluctant to call them legends because that can sound so dismissive. So thank you, Kathy Strain, for the strain of research you've been doing on Bigfoot and Littlefoot at that time.
Well, thank you.
Have a good night. Looking forward to our next guest, too, who also take a similar step with these Native American cultural perspectives. And we'll talk about the forensic work of Harvey Pratt. Go take a look online right now. Harvey Pratt and David Paulides is, I'm sure I'm pronouncing that wrong, by the way, but we'll find out in just a second. Two men who have been tracking Bigfoot, doing the forensic work and the investigative work, as they are both investigators in their own right with a law enforcement background. And this is obviously one of America's most wanted. We'll talk about that next on Coast to Coast. This is Ian Punnett. Well, Harvey Pratt and David, and I'm going to say this, Paulides. David, is that better? Paulides?
That's fine, Ian.
All right. No, I want to get it exactly right.
Paulides.
Paulides. Okay, it is Paulides. Okay. Our two people who share a similar background I mentioned earlier, both have a history of law enforcement. Dave received his undergraduate and graduate degrees from the University of San Francisco, spent about 20 years in law enforcement and working in the technology sector before being a founding member of the North American Bigfoot Search and Harvey Pratt is a Cheyenne and Arapaho tribal member, as well as an artist of the highest order. He has worked as a sketch artist, both for local police departments and for the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigations as a narcotics investigator, retiring in 1992 as an assistant director. His expertise in witness description drawing, skull reconstruction, skull tracing, age progression, soft tissue postmortem drawing, and restoration of photographs and videos led him to be involved in many high-profile cases like the Green River Killer, the BTK Killer, the World Trade Center 1993 bombing, and the Oklahoma City bombing at the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building, among others. I know there's many more, and more details I can read about both of you, but you heard your friend Kathy Strain on a few minutes ago, gentlemen?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Anything you wanted to add to that as she was talking about the Native American traditions as they're reflected through, from her perspective as an anthropologist?
Well, as Dave, I'll talk about one thing that she hit on initially that is key to the road that we followed, and that is that the natives didn't call Bigfoot hairy animal or two-footed bear. They called it hairy man. And I think that's a cornerstone to moving forward on the research on this. And when we decided to go down the path of looking and starting in Hoopa, California, it's a Native American reservation, we heard the same stories. They considered it a brother, just like Kathy said. They considered it part of another tribe. And that hairy man identity that stuck throughout the North American tribal regions was consistent. And that theme kind of continued to carry forward with us through Harvey's drawings and through our research, that it had this human connotation to it.
Harvey, you have a thought on that before I can throw another question at you guys?
Well, I liked what Kathy said, and Dave's absolutely right. And the drawings that I had done were really, when I first started, I had no idea what I was going to be doing. I just wasn't sure. And so it was kind of a surprise, and that we were able to draw different features. They were not all the same.
Well, I want to explore that in regard to your forensic work that we've linked up on our webpage at coasttocoastam.com. But let me ask you both, and however you, Dave, or Harvey want to answer this question. Kathy put on the table a kind of sexual stigma about associating with the whatever we're to call them, our hairy brothers, Bigfoot, however the Native Americans thought of them, and that was the taboo subject you weren't supposed to talk about, was intermingling. And I think in a way it speaks to that if that sounds like shame-based thinking. And if it had just been another tribe, or if it were an equal, I don't understand what the shame would be. But if it's something of which you're never supposed to speak, I wonder what that tells us about what their true feelings were about the equality of the Native Americans and the Bigfoot creatures that were living in the woods.
Well, I can tell you that in our early research, one of the books we went to was a book called The American Indian Reminiscence of a Yurok Woman. And it was written by a woman named Lucy in the early 1900s, and she was a Yurok woman living on the Klamath River right near the Oregon border. And in this book, she talked about the lifestyle of the Yurok. She was well educated. She wrote a very good book. And one chapter in that book talked about what was called the Indian Devil. And in certain parts of the western U.S., Bigfoot is called an Indian Devil in the early 1900s. And it talked about that interaction between the natives and the Bigfoot and how that moved forward. And she talked about how in the middle of the night they would come. Sometimes they would take food. Sometimes they would take a woman. When the warriors were gone during the daytime hours and the women were on the river, the Bigfoot sometimes would come in and kidnap a woman. Sometimes they would never see him again. Other times they would. Sometimes they would cannibalize her. Sometimes they would take it as a mate. And that theme from the 1900s was something that we weren't looking for, something that we found. And in our research in Northern California and talking to the people that lived on the river that were natives and just asking them to tell us about their background and their history. Other stories about abductions, females taking males, males taking females, it didn't matter, but it occurred, and some of the stories were as late as maybe 30 or 40 years ago.
30 or 40 years ago?
Correct.
With whom?
Well, as an example, I was up in an area along the Klamath, and there was a house, a very old one that sat along the river, and it had these stone stacks in front of the house, just a stack of stones. And some researchers believe that these stone stacks out in the middle of the wilderness were some type of trail reminder or some type of indicator that Bigfoot had put up. Well, I'd always wanted to stop there. I never did. Finally, one day I stopped, and a very elderly Native American woman came out. I engaged her in conversation, explained who I was. And slowly, the whole household came out, and it turned out that that house had been on that river for 150 years. And it backed up to the Marble Mountain Wilderness area, which has a long history of sightings. And I just asked the woman to tell me what the history is with her family with Bigfoot in the area. And what she went right into was a story where her cousin came up and visited them one time from, I believe it was Crescent City or Eureka along the coast. The girl wasn't familiar with the outdoors, but she came to visit the house, and the girls decided to go across the river, and at that time there was another house across the river with another family and visit the family. The girl from the city went across the river in a boat with these girls. She said, hey, I'm going to go to the berry bush right near the house and pick some berries for the family. She went to the berry bush, and she disappeared for almost a month. And obviously unfamiliar with the area, this caused great consternation. Tribe brought in 100 warriors. They searched for a week. They never found her. A month later, the girl comes back disheveled, dirty, and she told this story about being kidnapped by the hairy man. And that was probably one of the latest that had occurred, and that was probably in 1940s, 1950s time frame. But that history in that area with the relationship between hairy man, Bigfoot, whatever people wanted to call it, and the native tribes is consistent and still goes on today when they have their tribal dances in that area.
Harvey, you have a thought on that?
Well, I've heard stories similar to that, and some even closer to our time frame about the Bigfoot or Sasquatch having a relationship with Native Americans and people knowing about it, and the woman having to leave a certain area because she was familiar with Bigfoot.
Kathy had mentioned, you've heard that
here in Oklahoma.
Kathy had said that the stories that she had heard were had sort of featured a gender reversal. They were female Bigfoot species coming and kidnapping a male or forcing a male to copulate. And she said that those are the ones that she had heard about. I thought that was interesting.
Well, I have heard that. I have heard that, but I've also heard just the opposite too.
Okay. In any of your research, David or Harvey, any stories of offspring?
Well, there's a lot of rumors that go on, and some out of Washington where supposedly there were a couple of kids that were born, didn't live past their late teens, early 20s. And I know some other researchers prior to us had made some effort to try to find those grave sites, and I'm not sure if they were ever successful. There were also some rumors that in southern Oregon, in the Applegate area, that there was a family that had an offspring that was extremely hairy. But what I tell people when I hear these stories is that I remember that hypertrichosis, or the ability to produce more hair than normal and have hair all over your entire body, isn't something that's completely out of the realm of the human species as well, because some people have that in their genes, and those people you sometimes see them in circuses. Oh, yeah.
Or in my kindergarten class, because my friend Gary Kretschmer is one of the hairiest people I've ever met, and he was from a very early age, and it was very self-conscious about it, I think. But interesting how you're right. So for some people, that is a natural human condition. But I would think if there were that the Native American piece to that would imply that there's something about that allowed a special connection to their hairy man brother, and that it would be something that would be celebrated and something that would be featured as sort of a genetic bridge or a connection with somebody that would, as so often was the case, might imply that they would be better protected as a tribe or as a people because they had made this kind of. Okay, I know that's not me.
It's not me.
Which one of you is doing that, David?
I hope it's not me.
I hope it's not me.
I don't know what's going on, but it scares me. It scares me. Is what it does. All right. So again, we're talking about these Native American perspectives, the Hoopa, and then also the Cheyenne and the Arapaho. Harvey, you were involved with the Cheyenne and the Arapaho. Do they tell the same stories?
Well, some of the Cheyenne said they refer to them as, say, we're related. You know, I've heard them say that we're related, and then I've heard some of the Arapahos say that they're medicine people. That the Arapahos say that they got their herbs and medicine from the Bigfoot, and I looked at some ledger art that was done in the 1870s by a Kiowa who originally came from up north and down into Oklahoma, and he said that the Bigfoot came down with them, their relationship. It came down with them, and the drawing that I saw depicted a Bigfoot, a hairy person with a smooth face, with a basket, with an Indian in the basket, and a tree growing out of the back of the Bigfoot. And I asked one of the Kiowa people, what was that tree growing out of the back? And he said, oh, that implies that they came from the mountains. And in ledger art, if you were to identify someone, you would draw a little symbol of whatever, if their name was eagle, or they would or elk. They would draw a little elk or a little eagle above them, or put, so if he came from the mountains, they said he put a tree on him. So, that you see some history that goes back quite a ways besides the rock art, the pictographs in the mountains, So there's a culture that goes way back among the Indian people, almost from every tribe. Oklahoma has 39 tribes, and almost every one of them discuss or talk about some type of story or sighting or relationship with the Bigfoot in this area in Oklahoma.
Right. David, thought on that?
Well, part of the research we did at the front end was going into different libraries and things along the Pacific Northwest. We came across a series of articles written in 1924 that we had never seen before. And one of the title was Big Hairy Indians, Back of Ape Tail. And it's reprinted in the Tribal Bigfoot book that we have. And what a group of 3 Native American tribes, the Claylams, the Quinaults, and the Satsop, they held a press conference. And the reason being is that a sheriff was getting together a group of posse to go out and hunt these hairy things, that they call them, that supposedly threw rocks at some citizens that were hiking in the mountains. So this 3 Native American groups called a press conference to talk about it. And I'd like everybody to think back to the early 1900s and kind of the mindset that the public had with Native Americans. And to have a press conference of this type and to take it upon their shoulders to speak for this was actually a big deal, because the public perception of maybe Native Americans wasn't what it should have been back then. And what they stated was that the deputies and the sheriff shouldn't go out and search these things and hunt them down and kill them, because they are a different tribe. They're people just like us. They're hairier than us. They look a little different than us. They have a language. They barter with us. We go out and we meet with them from time to time, but they're not animals. And they have a language of their own, and they have much skill, and they're faster, and they're stronger, and they're not to be messed with. And this was an article, a series of 3 articles that came out in the Oregonian in 1924, So the thing that shocked us about this is why we had never seen these before. Here we have 3 Native American tribes coming together and speaking about this at a public presentation and putting some things right in the ground about language, about communication, about trading, about abilities. And that really goes to what Kathy's saying about the relationship with the Native Americans and maybe about their thinking ability and their intelligence as compared to everyday animals that you might see in the woods.
Right, right. Looking at the drawings that we've linked up to at coasttocoastam.com for people to go and take a look at the forensic work of Harvey Pratt. And I have so many questions about that to get to coming up. But the first thing that jumps out at me is the coloring and a kind of caramel coloring to the hairy body. Harvey, can you talk about that a little bit? I would have thought darker color would have been the consistent sort of dark-haired, more ape-like characteristics.
Absolutely. See, that was my first impressions were that we were going to be drawing more ape-like. Everything was going to be almost the same, color-wise, texture, body, hair, length. I thought, well, it's just going to be the same without knowing any little particulars. But as we started drawing and interviewing the people, that's a series of questions that I ask. Is I do an oral interview first. I do an oral interview to kind of stimulate recall, and we ask questions about color, and if you're doing a forensic drawing with a witness and you ask a witness what color was the hair, and they say a brown. Well, there's all kind of browns. And so over the years, we learned to try to be more specific, and that's what I tried to do when I asked someone about colors. And they would say, well, it was, the one man said it's almost like an autumn color. It was just reddish and browns and golds all mixed in. And then we did a blonde, 2 blonde, that were 200 miles apart, and they were golden blonde. And then we did a white one, one that was white, and I had no idea that was the situation, that we were going to see that kind of color. I did black, I did brown, light browns, blondes, white, and it was, to me, it was an eye opener, something that I didn't expect. But,
well, let's hold on to that thought, because Harvey Pratt's background, both working as a forensic artist, but also to working with the reconstruction of facial features from decomposed bodies, from skulls. I want to see how that informed how he drew the Bigfoot images that we have linked up on our webpage at coasttocoastam.com. And then back to some more of the Native American stories that we didn't get with Kathy coming up next on Coast to Coast. This is Ian Punnett. Talking about Native American Bigfoot stories. In fact, we're going to open up the lines coming up at the top of the hour. I'd love to hear where you are with this particular subject, whether there's anything that you've experienced, or if you have a Native American tradition that's been passed down to you. Harvey Pratt has spent a lot of time with the Cheyenne and the Arapaho tribal nations, and David with the Hoopa, and we're talking about their various perceptions of the Bigfoot stories of Sasquatch, both as a rival and as a brother and as a potential mating partner, and then in some of these cases, even as recent, it was in the last 3 or 4 decades. But okay, so the forensic photographs, the forensic artwork that we've included at coasttocoastam.com, great looking. But what do we have? What muscular structure? Has Harvey ever had any bones from which to work like he would as a forensic artist working on humans? We'll talk about that next on Coast to Coast. This is Ian Punnett. David Paulides and Harvey Pratt, two former law enforcement-oriented people over the years who have turned their investigations toward Bigfoot. Harvey, I know that you had done a lot of forensic work with reconstructive images of missing people, skulls that were found, and trying to figure out who that person might have been, age progression, that kind of thing. What's the best